Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 276, Alexander Rintoul. Alexander Rintoul died on the 24th of March 1911 in Queensland. He was the second saloon steward who died on the wrecked steamer, the Yongala. The SS Yongala was built in England in 1903 for the Adelaide Steamship Company, and she sank in a cyclone off the coast of Queensland with the loss of all 122 passengers and crew aboard. In 1905, Yongala's regular route linked Fremantle and Sydney via Adelaide and Melbourne. In 1906, her summer route was extended to Brisbane. At 5,000 kilometres, this was Australia's longest interstate shipping route, and the Yongala was the first ship to work it. Each winter from 1907 to 1911, she worked the route between Melbourne and Cairns instead. On the 14th of March 1911, the Yongala began her 99th voyage in Australian waters. Her master was Captain William Knight. She left Melbourne with 72 passengers and reached Mackay on the morning of the 23rd of March, left at 1:40 p.m. that afternoon bound for Townsville. She was now carrying 29 first-class passengers, 19 second-class passengers, 72 crew, and 677 tonne of cargo. Shortly after she left Mackay and before she left the side of land, the Flat Top Island signal station received a telegram warning of a tropical cyclone between Townsville and Mackay. The signal station sent flags and wireless telegraph signals, which prompted several ships to take refuge at Mackay, but Yongala did not see the flags. The Marconi Company had recently dispatched a wireless telegraph set from England to be installed aboard the Yongala, but the set had not yet reached Australia. 5 hours after the Yongala left Mackay, the keeper of Dent Island Light saw her enter the Whitsunday Passage, and this was the last known sighting of her. The cyclone sank her on the night of the 23rd to 24th of March. When the Yongala did not reach Townsville on time, at first it was assumed that, like other ships, she'd taken shelter from the cyclone, but on the 26th of March she was listed as missing. Wreckage started to wash ashore on the Queensland coast between Hinchbrook Island and Bowen. In 1958, a local fisherman, Bill Kirkpatrick, found the wreck 89 kilometres southeast of Townsville and recovered artefacts including a safe from one of the cabins. The safe contained only black sludge, but part of the safe's serial number was legible. In 1961, Chubb in England identified this as the number of the safe that it supplied to Armstrong, Whitworth and Company in 1903 for the cabin of Yongala's purser. So now more on Alexander Rintoul. He was born on the 6th of May 1859 at Inverkeithing in Fife, Scotland. In Glasgow, he married a stewardess, Nancy Reedy. He arrived on the 28th of August 1884 in Sydney. After his identification as one of the lost on the Yongala on the 22nd of August 1911 in the Melbourne Argus, Yongala steward's will, widow seeks probate in Sydney. In the probate court today, Nora Rintoul applied for the probate of the will of Alexander Rintoul. Counsel for the applicant stated that the facts were rather peculiar. The applicant's husband was a steward on the steamer Yongala, which had not been heard of since she left Port Mackay for Cairns on the 23rd of March 1911. No caveat to the will had been lodged, though a man in Melbourne who said he was the brother of Alexander Rintoul had written to the registrar about it. The applicant in her affidavit stated that while in Sydney, her husband gave a will to her, and while he was away, she became ill and had to go to hospital. When her husband returned to Sydney, he, at her suggestion, took charge of the will and placed it in the cash box in the Yongala. She'd received an affectionate letter from the deceased written from Brisbane just prior to the Yongala going on her last voyage. She believed that her husband had the will in his possession when the vessel was wrecked. The estate and effects named under the will were valued at £552. Counsel stated further that declarations had been filed by Nelson and Matthews of Melbourne, who attested the will in that city, and that there was also a certificate of death of Rintoul signed by the District Registrar at Townsville.
The Sydney manager of the agency for the Adelaide Steamship Company filed an affidavit that the insurance on the Yongala had been paid and the estate was valued at £600. His Honour said that in view of the circumstances which had been mentioned to him by the curator of interstate estates, the will might have been proved in solemn form. Mr. Edwards said that a brother of the deceased in Melbourne had written a letter to the curator in which certain matters were mentioned which the writer alleged would disentitle the applicant to probate. Mr. Edwards mentioned that a woman in Scotland had been referred to and would they give her notice. Mr. Atkinson responded, "With regard to her, it is only a rumour." His Honour asked, "What is the brother's name?" And Mr. Edwards said, "James, I think. The curator has the address." His Honour said, "The name of another woman in New Zealand has been mentioned by the brother of the deceased. She would have to be informed if she had a claim." His Honour said that it behoved the court to see that justice was done to all parties in matters of this kind. He would require that both of the attesting witnesses be called. Mr. Justice Street said that he did not think he could deal with this matter on evidence. However, he fixed the 16th of October for the hearing of oral evidence as to the contents and due execution of the will, and directed that notice be given for all persons interested. So on the 16th of October 1911 in the Sydney Sun, Nora Rintoul, who claimed to be the sole executrix of the will of the late Alexander Rintoul, second saloon steward of the wrecked steamer Yongala, appeared in the probate court today to prove the will of the testator in solemn form. Mr. Edwards appeared for Nora Rintoul and Mr. Innes for Sarah Osborne of New Zealand, who claimed to be the lawful wife of the deceased. The executrix in her evidence today said she was married to the testator on the 15th of August 1902 in Sydney. About 6.5 years ago, the deceased was employed on the Yongala, and at the time he was in Melbourne, where he executed a will witnessed by two men employed on the Australia Wharf. After the will was executed, the deceased handed it to the witness to read, and then he put it in a sealed envelope, which he gave to the witness to keep safely. She retained the sealed envelope with the will until July 1910, when her husband took it into his possession. Prior to June 15, 1910, her husband and herself and her family were living in a house in Paddington, and the witness had in her possession and under her own control all the papers, insurance policy and bank books of the deceased. On the 15th of June 1910, the witness had to go into St Vincent's Private Hospital. Her husband at the time was on a voyage, and when he returned to Sydney in the July, he called at the hospital to see the witness. She gave him the keys to her trunk, in which the will and the other papers were at Paddington. She was in hospital for 7 weeks. The witness had afterwards seen the papers in her husband's possession in the Yongala cash box. Her husband had never mentioned to her that he altered his will. She and her husband lived in the most affectionate terms, and she was positive he had not revoked the will. He had promised in 1902, when he married her, to leave her everything. She believed that her husband had the will in his possession when he went down in the Yongala. He had appointed her sole executrix of the will. The witness said that the deceased had told her prior to marrying her that he'd been married to a stewardess in Scotland, Nancy Reedy. Before marrying, the deceased witness was informed, whilst in England, that the deceased's wife in Scotland was dead. Mr. Innes asked, "Did he tell you he also had married a woman in South Melbourne?" She said, "Yes." "What was her name?" "Sarah Osborne Jennings." "Did your husband ever lie to you?" "Well, I suppose he did at times. All men are liars." Then there was laughter in the court. Witness admitted to Mr. Innes that now and again she and the deceased had small quarrels. She'd often asked the deceased about his Glasgow marriage. First of all, he told her he had to get away from someone in Glasgow. He said that he'd gone through a form of marriage with a woman up in years in Glasgow when he was young and foolish. At this stage of the cross-examination, the witness wept copiously. In a letter dated the 26th of May 1892, written from Ortona in Paddington to Jim Rintoul, a brother of the deceased in Melbourne, witness stated, "I want to know everything about the Glasgow marriage of Alex. He informed me on Wednesday night last about it. I asked him why his marriage with the lady was not legal. He told me all after deceiving me for 5.5 years. Another letter from her to Jim Rintoul dated the 1st of June 1892 said, "Now I have read the papers and letter and I'm quite convinced I would be safe to marry. Although Alec has been so unfortunate with women, I think he is to blame very much. In my own case, he made me believe he would get divorced from the Melbourne lady. My intentions are to take a single ticket to Manly and never return. That will be the greatest surprise he ever got in his life. I will take your advice and marry Alec. I have been very innocent regarding men, but he will not have his own way now. His Honour said, I understand the will went down in the Yongala, and Mr. Edwards said, yes, Your Honour, Mrs. Rintoul saw the will on board. In reply to Mr. Edwards, the witness said she saw the deceased's will together with other papers in a cash box on board the Yongala. In cross-examination by Mr. Innes, the witness said her maiden name was Nora Agnes Reedy. She did not use the name Agnes and was sometimes called Nancy. She first met Alexander Rintoul in 1896 when he was working on the railway. At that time, he told her he'd married a woman in Scotland and had left her there when he came to Australia on the Guthrie. He also told her on another occasion that he'd been married to a woman in South Melbourne. Prior to 1902, she visited Scotland and ascertained from the deceased's relations that his wife was dead. When she returned to Sydney, her marriage with Rintoul took place. She was not aware that she told James Sinclair when she wrote to him in 1902 that she intended to hide herself from Rintoul or to commit suicide. She never contemplated doing either and never had a harsh opinion about the deceased, who always treated her well. She did not complain to him that he'd been lying to her. Counsel also appeared for Sarah Osborne of New Zealand, who claimed to be the lawful wife of the deceased. And on the 21st of October 1911 in the Tamworth Daily Observer in New South Wales, from Sydney, Judge Rich granted probate of the will of the late Alexander Rintoul, who lost his life in the wrecked Yongala, to Nora Rintoul, who claimed to be his widow, and in favour, according to her evidence, the will was drawn. His Honour said he was not concerned with any matrimonial entanglements of the deceased, his duty being to determine what were the contents of the will and whether it was duly executed. His Honour said that he reserved his decision in order to read the notes of the evidence, and on the 21st of August, Justice Street ordered that the will be proven in its solemn form, with oral testimony to be given by both of the contestants of the will and the executor thereof, and directed that notice of the hearing to be given to James Rintoul, a brother of the deceased, and Sarah Osborne Rintoul, known as Mrs. Meacham. On the hearing before him, the former did not appear, but the latter was represented by counsel. Upon the evidence of the two attesting witnesses, he was satisfied that the will was duly executed. It was also proved that the will in question was in the possession of the deceased when he sailed on the ill-fated voyage on the Yongala. There was, therefore, sufficient evidence to rebut any presumption of revocation. From the evidence of the applicant and the two attesting witnesses, it appeared that the will was on a blue printed form. The depository provisions of the will depended solely on the evidence of the applicant, who stated in effect that the testator constituted her universal legatee and to be executrix of his will. He was not unmindful of the fact that the court received evidence of that character with great caution. However, he was satisfied that the applicant was a witness of truth, and being so, he found that the contents of the will were in substance or to the effect of the oral evidence of Nora Rintoul, and she be granted the will. The costs of both parties would come out of the estate. So who was Sarah Osborne Jennings? Sarah Osborne Manette Jennings was born on the 18th of January 1858 in Adelaide, South Australia. Her father, John Hocking Jennings, immigrated to New Zealand in 1874, and in May 1875 his wife, Martha Rebecca, joined him along with 7 of their children on the ship Tararua. Sarah Osborne Manette Jennings married Thomas Hancock in New Zealand in the same year she arrived, when she was 17. Her father died when she was 19 in Otago. On the 6th of November 1882, in Dunedin, Sarah petitioned for divorce. She was living at Annandale, New Zealand at the time. She then married Alexander Rintoul in Victoria in 1886. They had 4 children: Manette Mercer Rintoul in Melbourne in 1887, Eva Ruth in 1889, Ida Maud in 1891 in Williamstown, Victoria. Some trees have Manette commencing a relationship with John Travis Mackenzie in 1894 and having a daughter, Florence Lloyd Rintoul, with him in Williamstown in 1896. However, Alexander is listed as the father. It seems that many took the children to New Zealand in September 1909. In the New Zealand Truth on the 17th of June 1911, indecent postcards, result of a recent raid. The first prosecutions under the Drastic Indecent Publications Act of 1910 were instituted at the Wellington Court yesterday when a middle-aged woman, Minnie Rintoul, a newsagent and pictorial postcard seller, was charged on 4 informations with having sold postcards of an indecent nature. There were also 5 charges of having her in possession of postcards of an indecent nature, and there was also an application for an order for the destruction of the indecent articles. The defendant pled not guilty. All the cases were heard together. Constable Atkinson of Mount Cook deposed that he knew Mrs. Rintoul, who kept a shop at the Central Hotel buildings, and he went there on the afternoon in the May and purchased 4 postcards. He looked at the pictures of some women in the nude and asked for something warmer. A package was produced and he purchased the 4 cards. The cards were all haphazard in a box. Detective Lewis said on the 2nd of June he received authority from the Solicitor General to execute a search warrant on the defendant's shop. The warrant was duly executed and a search made of the premises, and postcards were taken possession of. There were also an additional 520 postcards seized. Mrs. Rintoul said, "I don't think I'm the only one in Wellington that sells that sort of card, and I don't think there's anything wrong in selling them." On the 6th of June, he received authority from the Solicitor General to prosecute. "Was there any concealment of these cards?" asked Mr. Jackson. "No, they were on the counter scattered about for the public to sort out, and comments were made by counsel that they thought it was more or less indecent. One card, Lewis suggested, was indecent, but there was nothing shocking about it." Mrs. Rintoul was a respectable woman, and action was taken because of complaints received. Though there were 4 charges of selling, the suggestion that if His Worship decided to convict, he would treat them as one offence. Mrs. Rintoul supported herself and her children. She was quite new to the business and made no secret of selling cards. No doubt someone had complained, but had complaint been made to the defendant, she would have destroyed the cards. Her act was that of an innocent person. His Worship said he looked through the postcards and came to the conclusion that some of the cards were indecent and some were not. According to the Act, it was perfectly clear the cards were indecent, and the sale and exhibition of these cards would have an immoral and mischievous tendency. On the first of each series of charges, he would inflict a fine of £4 in default of 7 days' imprisonment. Chief Detective Broberg withdrew the other charges. So a little on Sarah Osborne Jennings and Alexander's children, and as you would have noticed that her middle name of Minette was quite often used, and she referred to herself as Minnie. The first child was their daughter Minette. She married James Ferguson Scott in 1910 in New Zealand when she was 23, and she remained in New Zealand. They divorced on the 11th of June 1921. Minette Mercer Scott versus James Ferguson Scott for alleged desertion, habitual drunkenness and failure to maintain. Their second child Eva went to New Zealand in September 1909 and married Bernard Wills in New Zealand in 1912. They had 3 children in Wellington, and she died on the 30th of July 1973 at the age of 84. The third child was Ida, on the 17th of December 1913 in the Sydney Sun. The charge against William Henry Lumley, aged 35, of having, on the 29th of November at Sydney, fraudulently attempted to allure Ida M. Rintoul, aged 17, out of the possession and against the will of her aunt and guardian, was further investigated by the Water Police Court. Sergeant Bradley said that this morning he saw Lumley at Pitt Street where he was employed and told him that he wanted to show him some letters and photographs which it was alleged he had sent to young women who had communicated with him in response to his advertisement for a lady to travel. One of the photographs purported to be the residence of the defendant's father in England. The defendant said they were only a joke. Previously, the defendant admitted to the witness that he'd never been out of New South Wales. Mrs. Sissy Kennedy, formerly Pearson, stated that the defendant 2 years ago had told her he wanted someone to accompany his sister or aunt on a tour of the world. A photograph which the defendant showed her and said was one of his sister was, she believed, one of Zena Dare, an actress. She went with him up Lane Cove River where he asked her to get off with him at one of the wharves. She would not get off the boat. The witness then showed him the advertisement, which was as follows: "Young girl as companion, travel, England, America, 2 years. And he replied, "Yes, that is the advertisement I inserted in the Herald." The witness also showed him a letter which he admitted was the one he received from Miss Rintoul, and that another letter shown him was the one he'd written to Miss Rintoul. The witness produced 6 used English stamps which he found on the accused. He said to him, "You evidently had these stamps for the same purpose as the one as the bogus letter." Lumley replied it was all a joke. He said he was a married man with 6 children. The girl's aunt gave evidence and said that it was against the witness's wishes that Lumley or anyone else should take the girl out of her possession. In consequence of a letter, the witness communicated with the police. The girl gave evidence and said she wrote in reply to an advertisement on the 27th of November and received a reply. Subsequently, she and her aunt saw the police. On the 29th of November, she went to a spot near the White City. She had a white handkerchief in her hand so that the accused would know her. The accused came up to her and asked her if she was Miss Rintoul, and she replied yes. He said, "I am Mr. Carlyle," and added he would walk her towards her home. He asked if it would be with her aunt's consent that she'd go on the trip. He said the witness would accompany his sister, adding that she would visit Samoa, Fiji, New Zealand, and a place in America. His sister would start soon after Christmas, and he would be one of the party. He asked her if she was a good traveller, and she said she'd only travelled between Sydney and New Zealand. Mr. Abigail contended that the intent was the essence of the charge and must be proved. He submitted that this had not been done. All the evidence was that this young man had put an advertisement in the paper, met the girl by appointment, and was shadowed by police. There was, in his opinion, no prima facie case. Mr. Bathgate said it was not an isolated case. This had been going on for 2 or 3 years, and the defendant had met several girls. Mr. Payton said that the mere intention to commit an offence did not constitute an offence. So far as the evidence showed, there was nothing to point to the fact that the accused intended to take the girl away from the possession of her aunt, and Lumley was discharged. So Ida was living in Concord West and working as a clerk from 1946, and Florence Lloyd Rintoul was also living at the same address, and she was a buyer. In 1950, Florence and Ida sailed to London. Florence Rintoul was an associate director of McDowell's Limited. Florence's role in this business was to purchase exquisite examples of handmade jewellery, hence the reason for going to London, where Ida and Florence went on a tour of Great Britain and Europe and personally selected exquisite handmade jewellery. Aunt and niece were still living together in 1968. Sarah Osborne Minette Jennings, or Minette Osborne Rintoul, the name that she died under, died in 1945 in Burwood, New South Wales. On the 15th of August 1902, Alexander married Nora Agnes Reedy in Sydney. Nora died in Sydney in 1920. Nora had been born in 1873 at Kangaroo Flat, Victoria, near Bendigo, and she was 24 years younger than Alexander. It seems that Nora and Alex had children using Nora's maiden name. On the 29th of August 1920 in the Sydney Sun, Mrs. Nora Rintoul, a widow of Darlinghurst, was found in an unconscious state in the hall of her home this morning. Dr. O'Hara was called and ordered her removal to hospital, but she died before the ambulance arrived. Her death was due to natural causes. And the indicator that she did have children with Alexander, on the 29th of August 1921 in the Sydney Morning Herald, a memoriam was placed in loving memory of our dear mother, Nora Rintoul, inserted by her loving sons and daughter-in-law, Alec, Sid and Gertie. And a year later, in loving memory of our dear mother, Nora Rintoul, inserted by her loving sons and daughter, Billy, Sid and Alec. So Alex Reedy was born in 1898 in Richmond. The father was listed as Alex Reedy and the mother Nora Reedy. So after his untimely death on the wreck of the Yongala, it did uncover a little bit of a marital mess, which clearly Alexander Rintoul had committed bigamy twice in his lifetime.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.